He thought humiliating her in open court would prove his authority, but he had no idea he was handing it over to her. The courtroom in downtown Chicago carried that familiar weight of quiet tension, the kind that settles into the polished oak benches and echoes softly off marble floors, where every whispered word seems louder than it should be, and every glance feels like a judgment. Victoria Hayes stepped through the heavy double doors with a measured calm, her worn gray coat hanging loosely over her frame, her shoes practical, her presence almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. At 42, she had learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to move through spaces where people decided your worth before you even spoke. A security officer near the entrance gave her a quick once-over, his eyes lingering just a second too long, silently questioning whether she belonged there, then waved her through without a word. She nodded politely, clutching a thin folder to her chest as she made her way down the aisle, the soft tap of her footsteps barely noticeable beneath the low hum of conversations. Up front, Judge Daniel Brooks adjusted his robe with a practiced motion, his expression already set in that familiar blend of impatience and superiority that had earned him both respect and quiet resentment among those who knew him. He scanned the room, his gaze briefly landing on Victoria before flicking away, dismissing her just as quickly as he had noticed her. To him, she was just another face, another inconvenience, another person unprepared for the rigid structure of his courtroom. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the room like a gavel before the actual one ever struck. Victoria took her place at the defendant's table, setting her folder down with careful precision, her fingers lingering for a moment as if grounding herself. Around her, a few attorneys exchanged subtle glances, their tailored suits and confident posture creating a stark contrast to her modest appearance. One of them leaned slightly toward another, whispering something under his breath, followed by a faint smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Victoria noticed. Of course she noticed, but her expression didn't change. Her eyes remained steady, calm, almost distant, as if she were observing something far more significant than the quiet judgment unfolding around her. Judge Brooks leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the bench, his tone already edged with condescension. "Ms. Hayes, is it?" he said, glancing down at the file as though it were a minor inconvenience. "I trust you understand the seriousness of these proceedings, although I must say, you don't exactly appear prepared." A few soft chuckles rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled but not unnoticed. Victoria lifted her gaze to meet his, her posture straight but unassuming. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied, her voice quiet, steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without force. For a brief moment, something flickered across the judge's face, something almost like curiosity, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a thin smile that suggested he had already made up his mind about her. "We'll see about that," he said, tapping his pen lightly against the bench, the sound echoing faintly in the sudden hush that followed. The room settled into silence, but it wasn't a comfortable one. It was the kind that waits, the kind that senses something just beneath the surface, something not yet revealed. And as Victoria stood there, composed and unshaken, there was one thing no one in that courtroom realized yet. Not the attorneys, not the spectators, and certainly not the man presiding over it. That this quiet woman they had already dismissed was not just part of the proceedings, she was about to become the moment that would redefine them. Judge Brooks flipped through the thin folder in front of him with deliberate slowness, the faint rustle of paper amplified by the stillness of the courtroom, as if he wanted every second of delay to underline his authority, to remind everyone present who controlled the pace, who controlled the outcome, and more importantly, who did not belong. His eyes narrowed slightly as he scanned the minimal documentation, then lifted his gaze back toward Victoria with a look that carried more judgment than curiosity, the kind of look that had ended many arguments before they even began. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone now edged with a sharper impatience, "it appears you have chosen to represent yourself today." And though the words themselves were neutral, the way he said them drew a few quiet reactions from the gallery, a shifting of shoulders, a subtle exchange of glances that suggested this was already becoming a spectacle rather than a proceeding. Victoria stood without hesitation, smoothing her coat slightly before resting her hands calmly at her sides, her posture neither defensive nor overly confident, simply steady, as if she had done this before, or perhaps as if she understood something the rest of the room did not. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice still even, still controlled, never rising to meet the tension that was slowly building around her. Judge Brooks leaned back slightly, tapping his pen again, a small repetitive motion that echoed like a ticking clock in the quiet room. "That is ambitious," he said, allowing the faintest hint of amusement to slip into his voice, enough to trigger a soft ripple of restrained laughter from the back rows, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore. One of the attorneys shifted in his seat, leaning toward his colleague with a barely concealed smirk, whispering something that caused a brief shake of the head and a muttered response. The kind of low-level dismissal that filled courtrooms every day, unnoticed by most, but never by the one standing alone. Victoria did not look toward them, did not react. Her gaze remained forward, fixed not on the judge himself, but somewhere just beyond him, as if she were already thinking several steps ahead. "Let us be clear," Judge Brooks continued, straightening slightly as his tone sharpened. "This court operates under strict procedural standards, and individuals without formal legal training often find themselves overwhelmed." He paused deliberately before the last word, letting it linger just long enough to land as intended. Another hush followed, heavier this time, expectant. Victoria inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging his statement without conceding to it. "I understand the procedures, Your Honor," she said, and there was something subtle in the way she spoke, something precise, almost deliberate in its simplicity, that caused one of the older attorneys in the front row to glance up more carefully, his expression shifting from mild amusement to quiet interest. Judge Brooks caught none of it, or chose not to, his focus fixed entirely on maintaining control of the moment. "We shall see," he replied curtly, flipping the file closed with a soft but final motion. "Please proceed with your statement," he added, gesturing toward her with a dismissive flick of his hand, as if granting permission rather than inviting participation. Victoria reached for her folder, opening it with unhurried precision, her fingers moving with a familiarity that did not match the assumptions surrounding her. And for the briefest moment, as she scanned the contents, her eyes sharpened, not with anxiety, but with recognition, like someone revisiting a language they had not spoken aloud in years but had never truly forgotten. The room leaned in almost imperceptibly, sensing a shift without understanding it, while Judge Brooks watched with thinly veiled skepticism, already prepared to interrupt, already certain of the outcome, unaware that the quiet composure standing before him was not hesitation, not uncertainty, but restraint. And in that restrained silence, something began to change, something subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that had long appeared unbreakable, though no one in the room was ready to acknowledge it yet, not even him. Victoria lifted the first page from her folder with a steady hand, her eyes scanning the lines not with hesitation, but with quiet precision. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a clarity that seemed to settle into the room rather than push against it. "The matter before this court concerns a procedural misclassification under Municipal Code Section 12.4 subsection B," she began, and the words, simple as they sounded, landed differently than expected, drawing a faint pause from the judge who had clearly anticipated something far less composed. A few attorneys in the front row straightened slightly, their earlier amusement fading into something more attentive as Victoria continued without rushing. Specifically, the classification applied assumes intent that has not been established by the evidence presented. Her tone remained calm, but there was an unmistakable structure to her argument, each sentence placed carefully, each word chosen with purpose. Judge Brooks tapped his pen again, but this time the rhythm was uneven, as if he were recalibrating. "Ms. Hayes, this court will determine what has or has not been established," he interjected, his voice cutting in sharper than before, an attempt to reclaim the ground he felt subtly shifting beneath him. Victoria paused, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, her gaze lifting to meet his with the same steady calm. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, then continued without missing a beat. "However, precedent from the Illinois Appellate Court in Carson versus Fielding clearly outlines that inferred intent without direct substantiation cannot be used as a basis for classification. The name of the case seemed to echo in the room, unfamiliar to some, but not to all. One of the senior attorneys leaned forward slightly, his brows knitting together as recognition flickered across his face. Another quietly reached for a notepad, jotting something down with quick, deliberate strokes. Judge Brooks' expression tightened for the briefest moment before smoothing over, though the confidence that had defined his earlier demeanor now carried a subtle strain. "You are referencing appellate precedent?" he asked, the question framed as skepticism, but edged with something closer to surprise. Victoria inclined her head slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her tone unchanged. The ruling emphasized the necessity of evidentiary clarity before classification can be imposed, particularly in cases where the consequences extend beyond administrative penalty. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery, quickly subdued but impossible to ignore, the atmosphere shifting from passive observation to engaged attention. Judge Brooks leaned forward again, his pen now still in his hand, his focus sharpening as he studied her more closely, as if seeing her for the first time rather than the assumption he had formed moments earlier. "And you are confident this precedent applies here?" he pressed, his voice lower now, more controlled, but no less probing. Victoria did not look down at her notes this time, did not need to. "I am confident that the conditions outlined in Carson versus Fielding align with the procedural approach taken in this case," she replied, her words measured, deliberate, leaving no room for uncertainty. The room held its breath in a way that was almost tangible, the earlier undercurrent of dismissal replaced by a growing awareness that something was unfolding beyond expectation. One of the younger attorneys shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk gone entirely, replaced by a look of quiet disbelief. Judge Brooks opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the file before him, flipping it open again with a sharper motion than before, scanning the contents as though searching for something he had overlooked. For the first time since the proceedings began, the rhythm of the courtroom was no longer entirely his to control, and in that subtle disruption, in that barely perceptible shift of balance, the authority he had worn so comfortably began to feel less certain, though he had not yet realized just how fragile it had become. And Victoria, still standing with composed stillness, revealed nothing, not triumph, not tension, only the quiet patience of someone who understood that the truth did not need to be forced, only allowed to surface. Judge Brooks closed the file with a sharper motion than necessary, the sound echoing slightly louder than before, as if he intended to reassert control through sheer presence. But the effect did not land the same way it had earlier. The room no longer responded with quiet submission. Instead, there was a subtle shift, a collective awareness that something was no longer unfolding according to his expectations. He straightened in his chair, adjusting his robe with a measured pull, his voice returning with a firmer edge. "Ms. Hayes, citing a single appellate case does not automatically invalidate the classification applied here," he said, leaning forward slightly, his gaze narrowing as he fixed it directly on her. "This court considers the totality of circumstances, not selective interpretation." The words were precise, practiced, but beneath them there was a tightening, a faint urgency that had not been there before. Victoria remained still, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her expression unchanged, as if she had anticipated this exact response long before she ever stepped into the room. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, her tone respectful but unwavering. "And that is precisely why the application of the classification must be examined within the full procedural context, not isolated assumptions." She paused briefly, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "In this case, the documentation reflects an administrative decision made prior to the completion of evidentiary review, which directly conflicts with the standard outlined not only in Carson versus Fielding, but also in the subsequent clarification in Reynolds versus Grant. The second case name landed with even greater weight, drawing a more noticeable reaction this time. A quiet intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery, the faint scrape of a chair as one of the attorneys adjusted his posture, now fully attentive. Judge Brooks' pen remained motionless in his hand, his eyes narrowing further as he processed the reference, his confidence no longer absolute, now measured. "Cautious. Reynolds versus Grant," he repeated, his tone controlled but edged with something closer to disbelief. That ruling addressed a different procedural framework, he added quickly, as if reclaiming ground before it could fully shift away from him. Victoria did not rush to respond, her silence deliberate, giving the impression not of hesitation but of precision, as though she were selecting the exact moment to speak. It addressed the standard of review when administrative actions precede evidentiary validation, she replied, her voice calm, almost instructional, though never crossing into disrespect, which is directly relevant when classification decisions are made before the full context is established. The room grew quieter, if that were even possible, the kind of silence that carried weight, attention, and an unspoken realization that the dynamic had changed. One of the older attorneys in the front row slowly removed his glasses, watching her now with undisguised interest, while another flipped through his own notes, searching for confirmation of what he was hearing. Judge Brooks leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to be noticed by those closest to the bench, though he quickly masked it with a composed expression, his authority still present, but no longer unquestioned. "You seem remarkably familiar with appellate procedure, Ms. Hayes," he said. The remark framed his observation, but carrying an undercurrent of scrutiny, as if he were trying to reconcile the person before him with the assumptions he had made minutes earlier. Victoria met his gaze without flinching, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that now felt intentional rather than incidental. "I make it a point to understand the systems that affect me, Your Honor," she answered, her words simple, but layered with meaning that did not go unnoticed. A faint murmur stirred again, quickly subdued, but this time it carried something different, not dismissal, not amusement, but recognition. Judge Brooks opened the file once more, flipping through the pages with more urgency than before, scanning, searching, recalibrating, and for the first time since the proceedings began, there was a pause, not imposed by him, but forced upon him by the weight of what he was now confronting. And in that pause, in that quiet moment where authority hesitated, the balance of the room shifted just a little further, though no one dared to say it aloud yet, not even him. Judge Brooks adjusted his posture again, but this time the movement lacked the effortless authority it once carried, his fingers pressing more firmly against the edge of the bench as if grounding himself against a shift he could no longer fully control. The courtroom, once comfortably aligned with his rhythm, now felt different, quieter in a more deliberate way, every pair of eyes no longer simply watching, but evaluating. He cleared his throat, the sound subtle but noticeable in the silence, and leaned forward once more, attempting to re-establish the structure that had always worked in his favor. "Ms. Hayes," he began, his voice measured, though the earlier edge of condescension had softened into something more cautious. "You present these references as though they directly govern the matter before this court, yet you have not addressed the initial determination that led to this classification." He paused, as if expecting her to falter, to hesitate, to reveal the limits he had assumed were there from the beginning. Victoria did not move immediately, her stillness now carrying a different weight, no longer passive, but deliberate, as though she were allowing him just enough space to commit to his position before responding. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was a clarity in it now that cut through the room more sharply than any raised tone could have. "The initial determination, Your Honor, was based on a preliminary assessment conducted prior to the completion of a full evidentiary review," she said, her words precise, each one placed with intention. "And that assessment relied on a presumption that has not been substantiated by the record presented today." She lifted a single document from her folder, holding it just enough to reference, not enough to dramatize. Specifically, the report submitted on March 12th identifies a conclusion without establishing the evidentiary basis required under standard procedural guidelines. A faint murmur moved through the room again, but this time it was not dismissive. It was analytical, engaged. One of the attorneys in the second row leaned forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by focused attention, while another quietly flipped through a copy of the case file, searching for the detail she had just cited. Judge Brooks' gaze followed the document briefly before returning to her, his expression tightening as he processed the implication, his pen now completely still in his hand. You are suggesting that the court's initial position was formed without sufficient evidence, he asked, his tone controlled, but carrying a sharper undercurrent, the kind that signaled both challenge and defense. Victoria met his gaze steadily, her posture unchanged, her presence unwavering. I am suggesting that the classification applied relies on a conclusion that was reached before the necessary evidentiary threshold had been met, she replied, her voice even, respectful, but unmistakably firm. The distinction was subtle, but it landed with precision, and the room felt it. The older attorney in the front row slowly nodded to himself, as if confirming a thought he had not expected to entertain, while a younger associate beside him glanced up, his expression shifting from curiosity to quiet realization. Judge Brooks leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening again, though he quickly masked it with a composed expression, his authority still present, but now actively maintained rather than effortlessly assumed. This court does not operate on assumptions, Ms. Hayes, he said, the statement firm, but no longer dismissive, more a declaration than a dismissal. Victoria allowed a brief pause before responding, her eyes steady, her voice calm. Then the court will recognize that the current classification requires reconsideration under the appropriate evidentiary standard, she said, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one interrupted. Even the ambient sounds seemed to recede, leaving behind a stillness that carried weight. Judge Brooks looked down at the file again, flipping through the pages more deliberately this time, his movements slower, more careful, as if each detail now required closer examination. The confidence that had once guided him without question was no longer absent, but it was no longer alone. It was now accompanied by something else, something quieter, less certain. And as he reviewed the documents in front of him, the courtroom remained silent, not out of habit, but out of anticipation, because for the first time, the outcome no longer felt predetermined, and the woman who had entered unnoticed now stood at the center of a moment no one in that room could ignore. Judge Brooks remained silent longer than he intended, his eyes moving across the documents with a focus that had replaced his earlier certainty. And in that extended pause the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the usual rhythm disrupted by something far less predictable. The faint hum of the overhead lights became noticeable. The distant echo of footsteps outside the chamber door carried faintly through the walls. But inside, no one spoke, no one moved, as if the entire room understood that something subtle yet irreversible was unfolding. Brooks finally looked up, his expression composed, but no longer dismissive, the authority still present yet now measured, deliberate, as though he were choosing each word with greater care. Ms. Hayes, he said, his tone quieter, controlled. You present your argument with notable clarity, but clarity does not equate to authority. The statement lingered in the air, not as sharp as before, but still carrying an attempt to reassert position. Victoria did not respond immediately, her stillness now unmistakably intentional, her presence grounded in a way that contrasted sharply with the shifting energy around her. She simply nodded once, acknowledging his words without conceding to them, her eyes steady, unwavering. Judge Brooks leaned forward slightly, his fingers pressing together as he continued. This court must rely on established roles and formal qualifications when evaluating procedural arguments, he added, the emphasis subtle but deliberate, drawing a quiet reaction. From the gallery, a few exchanged glances that suggested the line had been noticed. Victoria's gaze did not falter, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision that had slowly reshaped the atmosphere of the room. Authority, Your Honor, is not diminished by clarity, she said softly. It is defined by it. The words were simple, but they settled into the silence with a weight that no one dismissed. One of the attorneys in the front row exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, while another leaned back, folding his arms as he studied her more carefully, no longer with skepticism, but with recognition. Judge Brooks' jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before relaxing, his composure returning, though now it required effort, and that effort was visible to those paying attention. He glanced toward the clerk briefly, then back to the file, flipping a page with slower, more deliberate motion, as though searching for footing in a terrain that had shifted beneath him. Even so, He continued, his tone steady but no longer dismissive. This court cannot base its determinations on interpretations that exceed the scope of representation. The phrasing was precise, but the certainty behind it was thinner now, less absolute. Victoria allowed a brief silence to pass before responding, her eyes never leaving his. Then the scope should be examined as carefully as the evidence itself, she replied, her voice even. Because limitations applied without justification risk becoming assumptions rather than standards. The distinction was subtle, but it landed with precision, drawing another quiet shift in the room. The older attorney in the front row nodded again, slower. This time, while a younger associate beside him glanced between the judge and Victoria, as if witnessing something he had not expected to see. Judge Brooks did not interrupt this time, did not immediately respond. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his pen resting untouched against the bench, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than before, not with dismissal, but with calculation. The room remained still, the silence no longer empty, but charged, carrying the weight of a realization that had not yet been spoken aloud. And in that silence, something deeper began to take shape, not yet visible, not yet declared, but undeniable to those who were paying attention, because the balance of authority had shifted once again, and this time, it did not feel temporary. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that forces people to confront what they would rather ignore, and Judge Brooks felt it now in a way he had not anticipated, not as control, but as pressure, subtle and persistent. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the cuff of his robe with a slower, more deliberate motion, buying himself a moment that no longer felt entirely his to command. "Ms. Hayes," he said at last, his voice measured, though the sharp edge from earlier had softened into something more restrained. "You speak as though procedural limitations are flexible, when in reality they exist to maintain order." The statement carried weight, but it no longer silenced the room the way it once would have. Victoria remained composed, her hands resting lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that now felt undeniable. She did not respond immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, seemed to draw every eye toward her, every expectation shifting to what she would say next. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority in it now that did not rely on volume or force. "Order is maintained through consistency, Your Honor," she said. "And consistency requires that the same standards be applied at every stage of a proceeding, not adjusted based on assumption or convenience." The words landed with precision, drawing a subtle reaction from the gallery, a few heads tilting, a few expressions tightening as the implication settled in. Judge Brooks' gaze sharpened, his focus narrowing as he studied her more closely, no longer dismissing, now analyzing, as though trying to reconcile the woman before him with the role he had assigned her at the start. "Are you suggesting this court has acted inconsistently?" he asked, the question framed carefully, his tone controlled, though there was a tension beneath it that had not been present before. Victoria met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "I am suggesting that the application of standards should be evaluated with the same rigor as the evidence itself," she replied, neither accusing nor retreating, simply stating what now felt increasingly difficult to deny. The room shifted again, not with sound, but with attention, a collective awareness that something fundamental was being challenged, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet precision. One of the attorneys in the second row leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful silence, while another glanced toward the bench with a look that bordered on curiosity rather than deference. Judge Brooks did not interrupt this time, did not dismiss. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his pen resting motionless between his fingers, his expression composed but no longer certain. He opened the file once more, scanning the pages with a focus that now seemed driven by necessity rather than routine, his eyes moving more carefully, more deliberately, as though searching for confirmation that the structure he relied upon still held. Victoria watched without expression, without impatience, her stillness now unmistakably intentional, as if she understood that the moment did not require force, only time. The courtroom remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of passive observation. It was the silence of realization, of something unfolding that could not be easily reversed. And then, just as the tension settled into something almost tangible, a soft but distinct sound broke through the stillness, the courtroom doors opening at the back, drawing every gaze in the room toward the source without a word being spoken. A figure stepped inside, followed by another, their presence formal, composed, carrying an authority that did not need to be announced. And for the first time since the proceedings began, Judge Brooks' attention shifted completely away from Victoria, his focus drawn toward the unexpected interruption, his expression tightening slightly as recognition flickered across his face. The room fell into an even deeper silence, the kind that signals not interruption, but transition, as if something larger had just entered the space, something that would change the direction of everything that had come before it, though no one had yet spoken the reason aloud. The moment the doors opened, the shift in the room became undeniable, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute, as if an invisible line had been crossed, and everyone present could feel it without understanding it yet. The two individuals who entered did not rush, their steps measured, their posture composed, dressed in the quiet formality that carried institutional authority, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. Conversations did. Not resume. No one whispered this time, because there was something in their presence that demanded attention without asking for it. Judge Brooks straightened instinctively, his earlier composure returning in form but not in certainty, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to assess the situation before it could fully unfold. "This court is currently in session," he said, his voice firm, though not as commanding as before. "State your purpose." The words carried structure, but the question beneath them was unmistakable. One of the officials stepped forward just enough to be clearly seen, holding a sealed document with both hands, the gesture formal, deliberate. "Your Honor," the man began, his tone respectful but unwavering. "We have been instructed to deliver this immediately." He extended the document toward the clerk, who hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward to receive it. The hesitation small, but visible, the sound of the envelope being opened echoed, more loudly than it should have. Paper sliding against paper in a room that had fallen completely still. Judge Brooks watched closely, his jaw tightening slightly as the clerk unfolded the contents, scanning quickly before looking up, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Your Honor," the clerk began, then paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "This is an official notice from the Judicial Review Commission." The phrase alone shifted the atmosphere again, heavier this time, more defined. A faint stir moved through the gallery, quickly contained, but impossible to ignore. Brooks' expression hardened, though the reaction came a fraction too late to mask the flicker of surprise that had already crossed his face. "Proceed," he said, his voice controlled, though quieter now, more measured. The clerk swallowed subtly before continuing. "Effective immediately, there has been a reassignment of judicial oversight for this courtroom." The words landed slowly, each one carrying weight, each one narrowing the space between what had been and what was about to be. A stillness followed, deeper than before, as if the room itself was waiting for the final piece. Judge Brooks did not move, did not interrupt, his gaze fixed forward, though the certainty that once defined it was no longer present. The clerk glanced down at the document once more, then back up, his voice steadying as he spoke the next line. "The newly appointed presiding judge is to assume authority without delay." The statement hung in the air, complete but not yet understood. Every eye in the room shifted, instinctively searching, calculating, trying to reconcile what they were hearing with what they were seeing. And then, without urgency, without dramatics, Victoria Hayes reached for the edge of her worn gray coat and slowly removed it, folding it neatly over her arm. Beneath it, the simple clothing that had invited quiet judgment gave way to something else, something unmistakable. The dark, tailored lines of judicial attire revealed with quiet certainty. The movement was calm, unhurried, but it carried a weight that silenced even the faintest breath in the room. She did not rush forward, did not make a declaration. She simply stepped toward the bench with the same measured composure she had carried from the moment she entered, her eyes steady, her presence now impossible to overlook. The realization did not arrive all at once. it spread, slowly, visibly, across the faces in the gallery, across the attorneys, across the clerk, and finally, across Judge Brooks himself. His expression froze, not dramatically, but completely. As the meaning settled in, the room went silent, not out of routine, but out of recognition. And in that silence, authority did not shift with noise or force. It shifted with truth, revealed in the quietest possible way. No one moved at first, as if the entire courtroom needed a moment to catch up with what had just been revealed, the weight of realization settling not with noise, but with stillness so complete it felt almost tangible. Judge Brooks remained seated, his posture rigid, his expression frozen in a way that no longer reflected authority, but interruption, the kind that comes when certainty is replaced by something he had not prepared for. Victoria Hayes stepped fully behind the bench with quiet composure, placing her folded coat gently on the side before. Adjusting the robe with a familiarity that required no explanation, her movements calm, practiced, unhurried, as though she had always belonged there. And perhaps she had. The clerk stood uncertainly for a brief moment before instinct took over, stepping slightly to the side, his posture shifting as he redirected his attention toward her, the transition subtle, but unmistakable. The gallery remained silent, every eye fixed forward, watching not just a person, but a shift in structure and power. In understanding, Victoria took her seat, her hands resting lightly on the bench, her gaze steady as she looked out across the room, not searching, not asserting, simply present. And in that presence there was something that required no announcement. "This court will proceed," she said, her voice calm, clear, carrying through the room with a natural authority that did not need to be forced. And for a moment, no one responded, not because they had not heard her, but because they were adjusting to what her words now meant. Judge Brooks exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, though the tension behind it was visible to those paying attention, and he rose from his seat with measured composure, stepping aside without argument, without resistance, his earlier dominance replaced not by defeat, but by the quiet acceptance of a reality he could no longer direct. Victoria's gaze shifted briefly toward him, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the moment they now shared from entirely different positions. She then returned her attention to the case file, opening it with deliberate care, her eyes moving across the pages with a focus that mirrored the clarity she had demonstrated before, only now it carried the weight of official authority. Upon review of the procedural record and the evidentiary standards presented, she began, her tone even, measured. The classification applied in this matter does not meet the threshold required for enforcement under established guidelines. The words landed without resistance, not challenged, not questioned, because the room had already shifted into a new alignment. One of the attorneys lowered his gaze to his notes, nodding almost imperceptibly, while another sat still, absorbing the outcome with quiet understanding. "This court therefore orders that the classification be withdrawn pending proper evidentiary review," she continued, her voice steady, leaving no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The decision settled into the space with finality, not dramatic, not loud, but complete. No applause followed, no reaction broke the silence, because this was not a moment for spectacle. It was a moment for recognition. Victoria closed the file gently, her hands resting once more on the bench as she looked out across the courtroom, her expression unchanged, her presence grounded in something deeper than position alone. The silence lingered, but it was no longer tense, no longer uncertain. It was reflective, as if everyone present understood, in their own way, that they had just witnessed something more than a ruling. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, as chairs shifted, and quiet movements returned, one thing remained, unspoken but undeniable, that authority may command attention, but dignity earns it. And on that day, in that courtroom, the difference between the two had never been clearer.